Nobody is a fan of the 1938 film director from Germany that came to America and developed the quintessential phrase for every rom-com you've ever seen. You see, Ernest is credited with the meet cute. You familiar with the phrase? Meet cute. Hallmark made it famous. To me, Rob Reiner is the one that really sold it to us in the 80s and the 90s. A meet cute is what the film directors call it when the couple, who we all know is going to fall in love and live happily ever after at the end, has their first introduction. It's their origin story. And it's just everyday, ordinary things, usually, plain as the nose on your face, nothing special, but we know more. We know more because we know how the story is going to end. We can see behind the scenes the actions that are taking place. And I say that because chapter 2 is Ruth and Boaz's meet cute. You heard how the story began. Ruth sitting with Naomi. They're wondering, what is God going to do? We don't know. And Ruth says, let me go glean. She's going to go gleaning in the fields. She doesn't know she's going to Boaz's field. She just goes to the field that she finds. But before we get to gleaning in the field, I want to make up a little story that might actually be true. In 1985, Seneca developed a food pantry. Anybody know what it's called? Anybody know what it was originally called? There we go. Somebody was listening at Men's Thursday. Golden Corners Ministries. If we think about Golden Corners Ministries, and this is the part where I'm saying it might actually be true, even though I'm making up the story. I don't know how they got their name, but it's biblical. Because the Golden Corners draws back to an age-old law out of Leviticus. We get it twice in Leviticus, once in Deuteronomy, about gleaning. And when you're harvesting your field, you are not to harvest the corners. You leave the corners for the widows, the orphans, the poor, the foreigner. Golden Corners Food Pantry. Like I said, I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's how they named it, but they sure should have. I checked their history page. It didn't say anything about it. But that's Old Testament law. So when we see Ruth going out into the fields to glean, what she's doing is actually a promised protection. It's their version of our Golden Corners Food Pantry. For the food insecure, that's their version of SNAP or EBT. It's their way of saying, you may not have land of your own, you may not have the support that you need to create your own crop, but we're going to make sure you're fed. Come harvest here. Now, the way the harvesting was done is the men would come through the field and they would cut the grain, the wheat, the barley, whatever they happened to be harvesting. And as it fell to the ground, the women, the servant women, would come behind them. They would gather up the sheaves, they would tie it off, and they would set it back down. And then then somebody else would come by and pick up all the sheaves that were tied together. Particular rules, again, laid out for us in Leviticus. If in that harvest process you miss something, you have to leave it. That's God's gift to the widows, the orphans, the poor, the foreigner. If you pick up the sheaf and something falls out, you have to leave it. That's God's gift to the widows, the orphans, the poor, the foreigner. In the corners, you don't harvest that. That's God's gift to the widows, the orphans, the poor, and the foreigners. It makes you wonder how we got from that law in Leviticus to our current day understanding of what it means if we're cutting corners. Today, cutting corners is a bad thing. Back then, cutting corners was a bad thing. It just is a different kind of bad thing today. Sorry, now you know where my mind rambles through in my basement when I'm working on these sermons. But I want us to understand that today, let me back up. Today we're talking about Ruth. Last week, of course, we talked about Naomi. Next week we're going to talk about Boaz as we go through this 4-part series, and then of course we'll wrap it all up in a couple weeks. But today we're going to focus on Ruth, and I want us to understand how hard Ruth was working, because it matters. Ruth's hard work, she was being watched, and in that watching, she caught the notice of Boaz. Part of their meet cute, she wasn't doing it to get his attention, she was doing it to put food on the table. Some random statistics about barley. When we look at what the Bible tells us about how she was reaping, what she was gleaning, and how it all got piled up together, it tells us she has an ephah of grain. Who here wants to tell me how much barley is in an ephah? That's what I thought. So let me tell you. An ephah was considered about 10 days worth of food for one person. So in one day, she had gleaned enough, gathered enough for she and Naomi to eat for 5 days. Now, some of you are perhaps more weights and measures kind of people. An ephah of grain is 29 pounds of barley. 9,125 barley heads, or I also know Tom is back there and he loves to do his math. Yes, Tom, that is 365,000 grains of barley that she collected that day. For those of you that prefer the metric system, 22 liters of barley. Of course, in my mind, I don't do liters, 5.8 gallons. Think about that Lowe's bucket. Thinking about your gallon of milk. Think about the barley head. She filled up a 5-gallon bucket and most of a gallon jug in one day. And for those of you who are, of course, I can't say it, but you'll know the word in my mind, not willing to get your hands dirty, and you're wondering, how does this equate to me? A grain of barley is a 1/4 carat in jeweler's measures. It's actually part of our early weights and measures system. And the jewelers designed the carat weight off of the grain weight. So yes, there's a real connection there. But imagine a 5-gallon bucket and most of a gallon jug full of 1/4 carat diamonds. You can't eat diamonds. So the barley was worth far more to her. So what's the story really about? It's not just a meet cute, because the meet cute is a rom-com story and this is the Bible. So we understand that the meet cute didn't just happen, but it happened by God's design. As we shared with the young at heart, God is the foundation of this story. Boaz makes it even clearer in his comments at verse 13. May the God you have chosen, the God of Israel, protect you under his wings. And then Boaz becomes that protection. Because you see, that's the part of the story that you and I get to sink our teeth into, where we get to take action, not just in hearing a story, but in how we live our lives. Because the providence of God, I wouldn't put a percentage on it, so I'll just say usually is revealed through people. God's hand at work, particularly in our day and life today, is seldom a cloud leading us by fire, leading us by day, fire leading us by night. We don't have the voice of God coming after the hurricane, the wind, and the rain in a still small voice. What we have is Taylor. Where'd she go? Oh. She went to the restroom. I feel like one of those bad comedians now. Taylor bringing us her clarinet. What we have is the choir lifting their voices, not knowing how that song is going to touch your heart, how that lyric is going to stay in your mind, and that theology is going to click days, weeks, months later. How when you bring in that jar of peanut butter on Peanut Butter Sunday, you are the Boaz feeding the widows, the orphans, the poor, and the foreigners. Because God's providence happens through God's people. But the fact that Ruth, we also, as I said, it was about Ruth, not God. So let's also recognize that for Ruth, it was about her character and what she did with her life. She didn't come into the field demanding to be allowed to pick the grain. She asked the overseer. And the overseer welcomed her because she had come humbly in to say, may I do this? Thursday at our men's group, one of the things that, and I can't remember the guy's name. Do you remember his name? Who's the current? Mike, thank you. One of the things Mike said was, when somebody first comes in, of course they have their whole vetting process, they do all the due diligence stuff, but when somebody comes in for the very first time and they're asking for food, they're usually going to get it. Because to simply walk in the door is giving up so much of their sense of pride, their sense of self. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you had to depend on the benevolence of others, but the humility that Ruth shows, rather than the arrogant, I deserve this, your law says you will give me this, she comes in humbly asking, not for a handout, but for an opportunity to work and work hard. She's granted that opportunity. But more than just being granted the opportunity, she's granted protection. With the protection also comes hospitality. Ruth, stay in my fields. I've told my men not to do anything inappropriate. Work behind the women. When you get thirsty, here's some water. Boaz being the providence of God when all he's doing is living the life that he knows to live because he's a man after God's own heart. You're sitting in this sanctuary today because you know you are a child of God. You live as a child of God. What I want you to hear is in your living as a child of God, pay attention because you're changing people's lives. You don't know it. You also have no idea what blessing God has for you 2 chapters later, simply for doing what God has called you to do. Boaz, as we get the introduction here at the first of the chapter, is a kinsman redeemer. We're going to talk more about that next week when we talk about Boaz. But as a kinsman redeemer, he goes beyond the minimum requirements. As I said, he offers her protection. He offers her hospitality. He offers her safety. He offers her an opportunity to work. But then he also feeds her lunch. And in feeding her lunch, the passage tells us she ate her fill and had more to take home to Naomi. Ate her fill. For somebody who falls into the category of widow, orphan, poor, foreigner. You know, those were 4 distinct categories laid out for Leviticus. Ruth hits them all. God's sovereignty, God's providence, God's provision in her life comes through the people of God. The grace of God expressed through the people of God. And you're saying to me, Russ, that's a nice load of holy theology and good, happy talk up there, but where does it get real? It gets no more real than how we're going to be interacting with Chip this week. The loss of a spouse, many of you know, is absolutely devastating. And we have the opportunity as the children of God to walk alongside Chip in his grief with the grace of God, with the theological affirmation that we know Dee Dee's in a far better place, and we have to balance the grief and the grace. And in walking alongside Chip, sometimes the best thing we say is nothing. It's simply being there. Imagine how hard it is for all the theological training you've received to be God's presence simply by being present. You don't have to have a class for that. You don't have to have a degree for that. All you have to have is the love of God in your heart. Boaz blesses Ruth for seeking refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. And his generosity serves as the blessing that he pronounces on her. With that blessing, her bitterness turns to hope. As you leave this place today, recognize that your mere presence can bring someone from bitterness to hope. The Word of God for the people of God.